Hey, friend. It's Steph here with a solo episode to talk about my visit to a podcasting conference last month and something fun I did while I was there. Podfest is the largest and I think longest running event for indie podcasters. I've been to the event twice before, and during those events, in my early days of podcasting, I focused on the educational component, really booking my days solid with sessions so I could figure out how to do this thing called podcasting. And for some reason, it was really interesting. I felt like an outsider the two previous times I attended the event. It was kind of a bizarre experience for me as a natural extrovert at a large event, but for some reason, I just felt like I was on the other side of the glass looking in, despite meeting some very nice people both times. So I was interested to see how it was going to go this year. But since then, one major thing has changed, and that is the establishment of the New England Podcasters Group, where I've made lots of wonderful podcasting friends at our monthly meetings. And a bunch of us went to the event, which meant I had a built in posse, and it changed the event completely for me. One of my fundamental goals for this show is growing visibility, awareness, and listenership. And I was trying to think of what I could do at the event that would be both in line with what we talk about on the podcast and also something that felt good to me. Because even though I am an extrovert, there is something that holds me back from being super performative or attention seeking, which kind of defeats the purpose of visibility and awareness just a little bit. So, my objective for the event was to find a way to connect with people authentically without looking salesy or overtly promotional, and best case scenario, have some natural conversations that people might remember afterwards. So, in a late night brainstorming session with my colleague and friend and ride or die creative partner, we came up with this crazy thing called the Midlife Burn Book, which I hoped would be a fun, whimsical way to engage conference participants with kind of like a specific nod to millennials. It was going to be a book, something analog and pop culture, sort of giving Mean Girls nostalgia without being too literal. And as someone who owns a marketing company by day, we had the tools and the talents to create it with less than 2 weeks to go before the event. So, the Midlife Burn Book is an actual physical book. Um, in fact, it's actually two books in one. Side one is the Midlife Burn Book, What You've Outgrown, which sort of signals an over 40 perspective, kind of like looking back at the transition. And then when you flip the book over, it's the Midlife Burn Book, What You're Questioning, which I hoped would signal sort of an approaching 40 perspective. And we designed it to be reminiscent of the book you might remember from the Mean Girls movie, and left some instructions along with some relevant graffiti on the cover. In addition to the title, it says, "Read, write a little, pass it on." And initially, I had planned to set the burn book free to float through the conference, sort of passing from person to hand based on these instructions. But by the time I showed up at the conference hotel, I was a little too much like a nervous new mama and didn't want it too far out of my hands. So it turned out to be either with me or a friend the entire weekend. But let me tell you, over the course of the weekend, I did capture a little bit of lightning in a notebook, which I'll get to in just a minute. So in the book, printed on random pages throughout, there were prompts that sort of distilled almost 4 years worth of conversations and interviews and themes that have emerged from the show. So let me run quickly through what right now I feel like are the top 10 kind of core themes of the Big 4-0. And they have shifted a couple of times over time. The podcast is coming up on 4 years old, so I think maybe if I looked at it like coming up on year 2, they might have been a little different, but as I'm having more and more conversations, doing more and more interviews, and getting sort of a bigger pool of data, these are the ones that seem to be the core to me right now. So, very quickly, number 1, when doing everything right stops working, my guests often followed a script, checked all the boxes, achieved visible success, but still hit a wall around midlife. And this can show up as burnout or numbness, restlessness, questioning, like, why isn't this enough? And it's usually because of misalignment, not necessarily failure. Number 2, the danger of pretty good or good enough or okay. This comes up again and again because pretty good or okay means not broken enough to leave yet, but not alive enough to thrive. So it may be socially or culturally rewarded, but internally it's draining because society only gives us permission to leave when something is clearly wrong, and usually clearly wrong to an outside observer. All right, number 3, moving beyond external authority and learning to trust yourself. And this is straight out of Gail Sheehy's Passages from the 1970s, but in the stories that my guests share and in my own story, it remains relevant. So this can be like letting go of parental expectations, releasing shoulds, whether they're related to your career or otherwise, and no longer outsourcing decisions or approval to bosses, elders, the culture, or prestige. And midlife is that moment when your inner voice finally outranks, outweighs, and is louder than any external scorecard. Number 4, burnout, but as a messenger, not a moral failure, which is important. Burnout shows up in many forms, including the body forcing us to slow down, the cost of overfunctioning, the result of loyalty to systems that don't reciprocate, and really framing burnout as information, not as weakness at this period in our lives. Theme number 5, identity collapse and reconstruction. Many of my guests experience big life events, divorce, career implosion, health crises, financial resets, among other life ruptures. And most of them learn that the loss is real, but it also creates freedom. And then this theme will include things of like mourning who you were, releasing identities that no longer fit, really pinning on your identity to your internal compass and not something external that can be taken away, and then building an identity that really feels true to you intrinsically, who you are. Theme number 6 is the hidden cost of people pleasing and overfunctioning. This one shows up constantly, even if the guest doesn't name it directly. And these patterns include like being the responsible one, the good one, carrying emotional labor, being quote unquote good at the expense of being true to yourself. And what happens in midlife is that we finally come to realize how unsustainable this strategy actually is. Theme number 7, slowing down, turns from what we maybe once saw as a failure or selling out or giving up into a strength. So this theme really reframes stillness, rest, having fewer ambitions, and a narrower focus as conditions that allow us to hear ourselves again, or maybe even for the first time. And this is a direct counter narrative to hustle culture. Theme number 8 is leaving without a villain. Many transitions involve good enough, as I mentioned earlier, good enough marriages, decent jobs, fine circumstances that we've stayed in too long for any of a million reasons. And midlife is when we learn that we don't need betrayal or disaster to justify change, and that we can make changes without becoming or identifying somebody else as a villain. Number 9 is the gap between cultural narratives and lived experience. Guests frequently talk about what adulthood was supposed to look like versus what actually happened, and either the grief or the relief, or both, in the mismatch. And so this could be career myths, marriage myths, productivity myths, having it all myths. That external blueprint or roadmap that we followed for so long and finally decide doesn't work for us as individuals. And number 10, the 10th theme that's emerged from my conversations on the Big 4 is becoming the author of your own life. And this is sort of what everything else points towards. After the unraveling that many people experience during this transition, they make braver, quieter, and more personally meaningful choices. They optimize their lives for alignment with their true selves versus approval from some external authority. And they start to really define success for themselves. And this is really what second adulthood is all about. It's less flashy and more honest, and far more livable and sustainable, we find over time. So those 10 themes informed the prompts that I placed throughout the Midlife Burn Book. About 10 of them were in the over 40 section. And then when you flip the book over, 10 of them were in the sort of under 40 or looking towards 40 version. So that's what I took to Podfest. Heart and throat, palms sweaty, not sure what was going to happen or even whether I was going to take it out of my bag. But my New England Podcasters group friends got the party started on night 1, passing the book around the dinner table. And that meant I had about a dozen entries right off the bat, which made it easier to break the ice with people at the conference the next day, people I didn't know. So thank you, NEPG friends. And I want to shout out my biggest cheerleader, the delicious Andy Lyons, a steward of the New England Podcasters Group and host of Don't Be Caged by Your Age, a pro-aging podcast. Thank you, Andy, for your support and your encouragement. So throughout the weekend, I used the book as an icebreaker with so many people, and many of them choose to sort of play my game and leave their thoughts in the book. But before I dig into the responses, there's something I want to say about them from a big picture perspective. At a podcast conference where everyone has a pitch, everyone's kind of, face forward, trying to get their own visibility and awareness out there, the responses that people wrote in this book were beautifully unpolished. They were emotional and direct and thoughtful and reflective. And I am just so honored and humbled at the things that people shared in this book. It went beyond my wildest imaginations of how this might go. So when I sat down with the burn book afterward and read through all the responses straight through, it was interesting how they sort of mapped to and overlapped with the 10 themes that I named earlier. And I wouldn't say that the themes were all represented or represented fully, but it felt like there were a handful of clusters of responses that represented like one or more of the big picture themes. There were 5 sort of buckets that helped me make sense of what people were writing on the page. The first one combined a couple of the themes above into kind of burnout coming from obedience and over functioning. And so this is really doing everything quote unquote right until it stops working, sometimes dramatically. And a lot of what people wrote in this category wasn't necessarily about workload, but more about putting yourself last, staying in roles too long, chasing validation. There was a lot about living by rules people didn't choose and paying for it later. One person wrote, I realized I thought it meant putting me last, and it caught up with me and everyone else around me. And another person said, those close to me stated they didn't ask for my help. So this combination kind of shows up again and again in these conversations, doing everything right, being helpful, being responsible, and eventually realizing that no one actually asked you to disappear in the process. And yet you did. The second cluster was around what I no longer need to justify. And this prompt drew the single highest number of responses, and the tone of them is interesting. They're not tentative reflections, they are declarations. One of them started with a very common rallying cry for midlife, I have no fucks left to give. And it went on, time is a precious commodity, so I have no time to spare. I have no patience for people spreading any kind of bigotry, and I no longer need to justify my contempt. And I'm sure many of us can relate to that. Insert whatever it is that you have no F's left to give about in your own sentence. Another person wrote, and this one's quieter, but just as firm. I don't need to justify that I am enough. I think we should all throw our arms in the air and hoot and holler for that one. Another one said, I don't need to justify my voice, my space, my calling, my decisions, my path in life. And it's interesting because this kind of feels like the hinge of the transition at midlife. We're not yet talking about reinvention, but we're definitely at the point where this is the end of explaining yourself to people who were probably never going to get it anyway. The third cluster of responses was around identity shedding, shifting, and grief. So these people were talking about what they thought they were supposed to be, identity they fought for, and when they realized it didn't fit. And some of these were so tender in a way that I absolutely was not expecting. One person wrote, I always thought I was meant to be a mother, and then I couldn't conceive. So I don't identify as a mom anymore. It was never meant to be my identity after all. Oof. Another person wrote, in my first marriage, I did everything to become the perfect husband, regardless of the parts of me I sacrificed. If you have to give up too much of yourself for a thing or person, you will be left with a shell of yourself. Oh my goodness. So this is really the grief side of midlife that doesn't get talked about enough, I don't think. It's not just losing people or roles or identities, but losing versions of yourself, either you thought you were going to be or that maybe you were praised for. The fourth cluster was, and I'm sure so many of us can relate to this, exhaustion as information. So this overlaps with burnout, but it's a little bit different, slightly more reflective. It's when you stop treating exhaustion like a character flaw and really start interpreting it as a message. One person wrote very plainly, what I finally learned is that busy, tired, overworked is not a badge of honor. Being exhausted made me less capable of being present. And another person wrote, I was moving too fast, too much. And it's interesting about these because exhaustion is not usually the problem. It's the symptom. So the fifth and final sort of cluster of responses was around alignment and purpose and redefining success from the inside out. And these responses really felt like they were at the intersection of sort of moving beyond that external authority, slowing down, and also becoming the author of your own life. Not like in this like grand motivational speech kind of way, but more like this is what matters now and I'm done pretending that it doesn't. One person very plainly wrote, knowing the will of God for my life and being right in the center of it. Another distilled it into a sentence that could probably double as the thesis for this whole show. Progress doesn't have to be aggressive to be effective. And another person sort of did like almost a word exercise. Peace, alignment. Peace, clarity, and peace, God's guidance. So it's so interesting because these aren't necessarily about chasing more, but about choosing what we want to chase and what we want to put in our lives. So those were the clusters that emerged for me. But there's an interesting second layer here because the prompts that people chose to respond to said almost as much as what they wrote. After I read the responses, I went back and sort of counted, and I wanted to know which questions people actually grabbed onto and gravitated to. So the two most responded to prompts were, one, I realized that doing everything right wasn't working when, and that one had 5 responses. And number 2, what I no longer need to justify had 6 responses. And so these are the prompts I think that really reflect the start of this transition around age 40, that threshold, people starting to consider why isn't the strategy working, and maybe when did it fail, and what am I done explaining to anyone else? Then there was a cluster of prompts with 3 responses each, and those were a success that didn't feel the way I expected, what exhaustion was trying to tell me, an identity I mistook for who I really am, and something I did by the book that didn't deliver what I expected. And what's interesting about these is that if you put them all together, they are all sort of post-disillusionment prompts. So the person answering these has already identified that something was broken, and they're now trying to capture what it cost them. And then the least responded to prompts, the ones with only 1 or 2 answers, tended to be more about resolution, values, recalibration, permission, good enough, fear, those kinds of things. Prompts like what success means to me now, something that's good enough that I continue to tolerate, those kinds of things. And it makes sense, I think, because it's a lot easier to describe the rupture than the resolution, I guess. And especially at a conference, especially at a dinner table, especially in a book that someone you don't know just handed you, said, "Do you want to play my game?" Because that rupture is often clearer and easier to define, and the resolution is a little bit more nuanced and sometimes takes longer. But I think the bottom line that this little book confirmed for me is that the transition around age 40 is pretty much universal, whether we know about it or not. People at the conference really recognized themselves in the prompts, even if they had never explicitly understood or considered this transition before. So I went into Podfest thinking that this would be a playful way to start conversations and sort of network and engage with people. What I didn't expect was how consistently people wrote things that maybe they hadn't said out loud before, or maybe they hadn't put together previously. But it did confirm for me that the questions that we keep circling around on this show are definitely not abstract. They're sitting right under the surface for a lot of people. All it took was the right moment, a blank page, and a little push from me to close that loop. And I think what has stayed with me for the couple of weeks since the conference, after digesting the responses, wasn't necessarily any single entry, although there were some great ones, um, but the consistency across them. Different lives, different people, different ages, different circumstances, and yet a lot of the same kind of thinking or work happening under the surface. So I'm still sitting with the responses, and I will probably come back to them again at some point, either in another solo or maybe play with them on Instagram or something like that. But if you'd like to see or hear any more about the burn book, definitely drop me a line either on Instagram or on the website, thebig40.com, and let me know what you want to know. Or if you're interested in me sharing some more of the prompts here, either here in the podcast, or I could also see like having fun sharing the prompts out in the world and then one by one, and then kind of like capturing them together and reflecting on those. So I'll finish up today by saying thank you to my New England podcasters friends. Thank you to everyone at Podfest for contributing to this book and to the things I talk about here on the Big 40. And thanks to you for listening today. I'll see you next time.